The Situation Room beneath the Department of Justice had been sealed for the past 6 hours, with Attorney General Pam Bondi presiding over the most critical domestic terrorism briefing in decades. The walls were lined with high-resolution surveillance photographs, intercepted communications transcripts, and tactical maps showing the approaches to the United States Capitol building. The red-stamped classification markings on every document told the story of an investigation that had consumed the resources of multiple federal agencies for 8 months, culminating in intelligence that had sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. The room itself had been configured as a crisis management center, with secure communication links to every major federal law enforcement agency, military command centers, and even the White House Situation Room. 37 workstations equipped with classified computer systems allowed real-time coordination with field agents across the country. The security protocols were so stringent that even senior Justice Department officials required special authorization to enter the facility, and all electronic devices had been secured in electromagnetic isolation chambers to prevent any possibility of surveillance or communication with outside parties. The terrorist cell, known internally as the Patriot Liberation Front, had been planning what federal investigators described as the most ambitious domestic terrorist attack since the Oklahoma City bombing. Their target was not just the Capitol building, but a coordinated assault designed to occur during a joint session of Congress, potentially killing hundreds of elected officials and staff members in a single devastating blow to American democracy. But what made this plot particularly terrifying was its sophistication. This was not a group of angry extremists with crude weapons, but a well-organized terrorist organization with military training, inside knowledge of security procedures, and access to advanced weapons and explosives. The investigation had revealed that the Patriot Liberation Front represented a new evolution in domestic terrorism. Unlike previous extremist groups that had been characterized by poor planning and limited capabilities, this organization had spent over 2 years in careful preparation, studying previous attacks, analyzing security vulnerabilities, and developing sophisticated operational plans that accounted for law enforcement response procedures. They had essentially created a terrorist organization that operated with the discipline and planning of a military unit, while maintaining the ideological fervor of religious extremists. Bondi stood before the assembled crisis management team, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the threat they were confronting. "Gentlemen and ladies, we have confirmed intelligence that domestic terrorists are planning to attack the United States Capitol in less than 18 hours. This is not a drill, this is not a political statement, and this is not a protest that has gotten out of hand. This is a planned military-style assault on the seat of American democracy by individuals who have declared war on the United States government." The assembled crisis management team represented the most experienced counterterrorism professionals in federal law enforcement. FBI Counterterrorism Division Director Marcus Rodriguez had spent 20 years investigating domestic terrorism threats. Homeland Security Secretary Jennifer Martinez had coordinated responses to major terrorist incidents and infrastructure attacks. Capitol Police Chief David Thompson had protected the legislative branch through multiple security crises. NSA Director Patricia Walsh had provided intelligence support for counterterrorism operations around the world. Yet each of these seasoned professionals had been shocked by the scope and sophistication of the Patriot Liberation Front's attack plan. This was not the work of isolated extremists or loosely organized militia groups. This was a comprehensive terrorist operation that had been planned with military precision and executed with the discipline of a professional military unit. The investigation had begun 10 months earlier, when FBI counterterrorism analysts noticed unusual patterns in online communications and weapons purchases across multiple states. Social media monitoring systems had flagged conversations that used coded language to discuss patriotic action and restoration of constitutional government. The language was sophisticated enough to avoid triggering automatic surveillance systems, but persistent enough to suggest organized planning rather than random extremist rhetoric. The initial detection had come from the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Intelligence Unit, which processed millions of communications daily, looking for indicators of terrorist planning. Senior analyst Dr. Michael Stevens had been reviewing quarterly threat assessments when he noticed statistical anomalies in extremist communications patterns across multiple online platforms. The anomalies were subtle but significant, In regions with historically high levels of anti-government extremist activity, the volume of online communications had actually decreased over the past 6 months. More concerning was the geographic correlation. Areas showing reduced extremist communications were connected by major interstate highways and included cities with significant federal government facilities. Dr. Stevens had spent his career analyzing domestic terrorism threats, from white supremacist organizations to anti-government militias to religious extremist groups. He had developed analytical techniques that could identify operational planning patterns in massive datasets, methods that had been used to prevent dozens of domestic terrorist attacks over the past decade. But the patterns he was seeing in the Patriot Liberation Front investigation were unlike anything in his experience. They suggested coordination and planning on a scale that challenged assumptions about domestic extremist capabilities. FBI Counterterrorism Division Director Marcus Rodriguez presented the intelligence picture that had emerged from months of investigation. Rodriguez had spent 20 years investigating domestic terrorism, from militia groups in the 1990s to white supremacist organizations in the 2000s to more recent far-right extremist movements. But the Patriot Liberation Front represented something new, a sophisticated terrorist organization that combined traditional extremist ideology with advanced operational planning and military-style tactics. Rodriguez's career had been built on understanding how domestic extremist groups evolved and adapted to law enforcement pressure. He had witnessed the transformation of domestic terrorism from relatively simple bombing plots to sophisticated networks that used advanced technology and military tactics. He had investigated cases ranging from the Unabomber to the Michigan militia movement to more recent incidents involving white supremacist violence. But the Patriot Liberation Front case had revealed a level of sophistication that challenged every assumption about domestic extremist capabilities. This was not a loosely organized group of angry individuals. This was a terrorist organization that had been systematically planned and constructed using principles of military organization and operational security that rivaled foreign terrorist organizations. The cell consists of 17 individuals spread across 7 states, Rodriguez began, clicking through photographs of suspects that had been taken during months of surveillance. The leadership includes former military personnel with combat experience, current and former law enforcement officers, and individuals with specialized technical skills in explosives and communications. This is not a group of angry protesters. This is a terrorist organization with the capabilities to carry out sophisticated attacks against high-value targets. The photographs revealed the diversity and sophistication of the terrorist organization. The suspects ranged in age from 28 to 54, included both men and women, and represented a cross-section of American society that would have been impossible to profile using traditional law enforcement methods. They included small business owners, military veterans, retired police officers, and even a former federal employee who had worked for the Department of Homeland Security. What united them was not demographic characteristics or social background, but a shared ideology that viewed the federal government as illegitimate and violent action as necessary to restore what they considered constitutional governance. Intelligence analysis had revealed that the group had been recruited through a sophisticated process that identified individuals with specific skills and psychological profiles that made them suitable for terrorist operations. The cell's leadership structure was both sophisticated and terrifying. The operational commander was Colonel Marcus Steele, a retired Army Special Forces officer who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before being discharged for what military records described as ideological incompatibility with mission requirements. Steele had maintained his tactical skills through participation in private security companies and had spent the past 2 years recruiting individuals with complementary skills for what he called constitutional restoration operations. Steele's military record was both impressive and troubling. He had commanded Special Forces units in some of the most dangerous combat operations in Afghanistan, earning multiple decorations for valor and tactical expertise. His units had conducted raids against Taliban and al-Qaeda targets that required precisely the kind of planning and execution that characterized the Capitol attack plot. But Steele's military service had also included incidents that suggested psychological problems and extremist sympathies. He had been investigated for excessive force during detention operations and had been disciplined for making inappropriate comments about civilian casualties. His final efficiency report had noted concerns about his inability to distinguish between legitimate military targets and inappropriate personal vendettas. Steele's transition from military service to extremist leadership had been gradual but systematic. He had initially joined private security companies that employed former military personnel for overseas operations. These companies had provided him with continued access to advanced weapons and tactical training, while exposing him to other military veterans who shared his disillusionment with federal government policies. Steele's recruitment into extremist networks had occurred through online forums and private meetings that brought together military veterans who felt betrayed by government policies. These networks had provided him with ideological justification for his anti-government sentiments, while connecting him with other individuals who possessed the skills and motivation necessary for terrorist operations. Steele's second-in-command was Detective Sarah Williams, a 15-year veteran of the Phoenix Police Department who had been placed on administrative leave for excessive force complaints. Williams had provided the cell with inside knowledge of law enforcement response procedures and had used her access to police databases to conduct background checks on potential recruits and gather intelligence on federal law enforcement operations. Williams represented the most dangerous type of domestic terrorist, a law enforcement insider who had turned her professional training and access against the institutions she had sworn to protect. Her police career had been marked by incidents that suggested both tactical competence and psychological instability. She had received commendations for bravery in dangerous situations while simultaneously accumulating complaints for unnecessary violence and inappropriate use of force. Her transformation from police officer to terrorist had been gradual but systematic. Williams had initially joined online forums where law enforcement officers discussed their frustrations with federal policies and judicial decisions. These forums had provided a pathway to more extreme networks that portrayed federal law enforcement agencies as enemies of constitutional governance. Williams had used her law enforcement access to provide the terrorist cell with critical intelligence about federal security procedures. She had conducted database searches on potential targets, analyzed law enforcement response protocols, and even provided information about the personal lives of federal officials who might be targeted for assassination. Her insider knowledge had been essential to the sophistication of the terrorist plot. The cell's technical specialist was Dr. James Morrison, a former explosives expert who had worked for defense contractors before losing his security clearance due to associations with extremist groups. Morrison had developed improvised explosive devices that federal investigators described as military-grade weapons capable of causing mass casualties and extensive structural damage. Morrison's background was particularly troubling because it combined advanced technical expertise with extremist ideology. He had earned a doctorate in chemistry from MIT and had spent 10 years working on explosive systems for the Department of Defense. His legitimate career had provided him with knowledge of advanced explosive techniques that were typically available only to military and intelligence professionals. Morrison's transition to extremist networks had occurred after he lost his security clearance due to financial problems and associations with anti-government groups. His bitterness over losing his career had been exploited by extremist recruiters who had convinced him that his technical skills could be used to strike back at the government that had destroyed his livelihood. The explosive devices that Morrison had developed for the terrorist plot were sophisticated beyond anything typically encountered in domestic terrorism cases. They included shaped charges designed to breach reinforced concrete barriers, incendiary devices that could create massive fires in enclosed spaces, and even chemical weapons that could be dispersed through building ventilation systems. Perhaps most disturbing was the cell's intelligence chief, Agent Rebecca Torres, a former NSA analyst who had been terminated for unauthorized access to classified information. Torres had provided the cell with sophisticated surveillance capabilities and had used her knowledge of federal intelligence operations to help the cell avoid detection during their planning phase. Torres had worked at NSA for 8 years, analyzing communications intelligence and developing techniques for identifying terrorist networks through electronic surveillance. Her legitimate career had provided her with inside knowledge of how federal intelligence agencies detected and tracked terrorist organizations. This knowledge had been essential to the Patriot Liberation Front's ability to avoid detection during their extensive planning phase. Torres had been terminated from NSA after she was discovered accessing classified information outside her assigned responsibilities. Internal investigations had revealed that she had been searching databases for information about domestic surveillance programs and had been copying classified documents that she claimed were evidence of government overreach and constitutional violations. Her recruitment by the Patriot Liberation Front had provided the terrorist organization with capabilities that were typically available only to nation-state actors. Torres had taught other cell members how to use encrypted communications that could avoid federal surveillance, how to conduct counter-surveillance to detect law enforcement monitoring, and how to analyze federal security procedures to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The terrorist plot itself was complex and carefully planned. Phase 1 involved simultaneous attacks on electrical infrastructure around Washington, D.C., all designed to create widespread power outages that would disrupt security systems and emergency response capabilities. Phase 2 would involve attacks on key transportation hubs, preventing law enforcement reinforcements from reaching the Capitol area. Phase 3 was the main assault on the Capitol building itself, timed to coincide with a joint session of Congress when maximum casualties could be achieved. The infrastructure attack component was particularly sophisticated and demonstrated the terrorists' understanding of modern urban vulnerabilities. They had identified 4 critical electrical substations that supplied power to the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, including backup systems that provided emergency power to government facilities. The simultaneous destruction of these facilities would create cascading failures that could leave the entire capital region without electrical power for days or weeks. The electrical grid analysis had been conducted by Morrison and Torres working together, combining Morrison's technical expertise in explosives with Torres's knowledge of critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. They had used publicly available information about electrical grid management, combined with classified information that Torres had accessed during her time at NSA, to identify single points of failure that could be exploited to maximize disruption. The transportation attack component was designed to isolate the capital area from law enforcement reinforcements and emergency services. The terrorists had identified key bridges, highway interchanges, and rail lines that could be destroyed to create transportation bottlenecks that would prevent effective response to the main attack. They had also planned to attack Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport and Union Station to prevent federal tactical teams from being deployed from other regions. The transportation analysis had been led by Steele and Williams, who had used their professional backgrounds to identify vulnerabilities in law enforcement response procedures. Steele's military experience had taught him how to analyze transportation networks for strategic vulnerabilities, while Williams's law enforcement background had provided her with knowledge of how police and federal agents would attempt to respond to a major terrorist incident. The sophistication of this plot is unprecedented in domestic terrorism cases, Rodriguez continued, displaying tactical diagrams that showed the terrorists' planned approach routes and assault positions. They've studied previous attacks on government facilities, analyzed security vulnerabilities, and developed countermeasures for federal law enforcement response procedures. This is essentially a military operation planned by individuals with inside knowledge of how our security systems function. The Capitol assault plan itself was brutal in its simplicity and effectiveness. The terrorists would approach the building from multiple directions simultaneously, using explosives to breach security barriers and automatic weapons to suppress security forces. Their objective was not to occupy the building, but to cause maximum casualties among elected officials and staff during a joint session of Congress. The assault plan had been developed using detailed intelligence about Capitol security procedures that had been gathered through months of surveillance and reconnaissance. The terrorists had studied shift changes, security protocols, and emergency procedures. They had even conducted test runs of their approach routes during major events to time their movements and identify potential obstacles. Most disturbing was the level of detail in their casualty planning. The terrorists had calculated the number of people likely to be present during a joint session of Congress and had planned their attack to maximize deaths among elected officials, staff members, and visitors. They had even prepared contingency plans for dealing with survivors and had discussed the possibility of taking hostages to extend the duration of the attack and increase media coverage. The timing was critical to the terrorists' plan. Joint sessions of Congress brought together members of both houses of the legislature, along with senior government officials and staff members. The concentrated presence of American political leadership created an opportunity for the terrorists to achieve their objective of decapitating the federal government in a single attack. The terrorists had studied the security procedures used during joint sessions and had developed specific tactics to exploit vulnerabilities in the enhanced security measures. They had identified locations where explosives could be placed to cause structural damage that would trap occupants inside the building. They had also planned to use chemical weapons to force evacuation into areas where they could achieve maximum casualties. The psychological impact of the attack was as important to the terrorists as the physical damage. They believed that murdering hundreds of elected officials in a single attack would demonstrate the weakness of the federal government and inspire other extremist groups to launch similar operations. They had prepared statements and manifestos that would be released immediately after the attack to provide ideological justification for their actions and encourage copycat attacks. The intelligence breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Agent Michael Carter, an FBI counterterrorism specialist who had been conducting routine surveillance of social media platforms, had noticed that several individuals associated with extremist groups had suddenly stopped posting content that had been consistent for months. The sudden silence, rather than increased activity, had triggered suspicions that something significant was being planned. Carter had worked with NSA analysts to trace the digital footprints of the individuals who had gone silent online. The analysis revealed that they had shifted to encrypted communication platforms and had been coordinating travel to the Washington, D.C. area. More concerning was evidence that they had been conducting surveillance of federal facilities and had acquired vehicles and equipment consistent with planning a major operation. Homeland Security Secretary Jennifer Martinez presented the assessment of the threat to critical infrastructure. Martinez had spent her career analyzing threats to American infrastructure, from cyber attacks on power grids to physical attacks on transportation systems. But the Patriot Liberation Front's plan represented a comprehensive assault on the systems that kept American government functioning. The terrorists have identified critical vulnerabilities in the electrical grid serving the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, Martinez reported, displaying maps that showed power distribution systems and key transmission facilities. Their plan involves coordinated attacks on 4 major substations that would create cascading failures affecting not just government facilities, but hospitals, emergency services, and civilian infrastructure throughout the region. The infrastructure attacks were not random vandalism, but carefully planned operations designed to maximize disruption and prevent effective response to the main assault on the capital. The terrorists had studied the regional power grid for months, identifying single points of failure that could be exploited to create widespread blackouts. They had also planned attacks on telecommunications infrastructure that would disrupt emergency communications and prevent coordination between law enforcement agencies. The transportation component of the attack was equally sophisticated. The terrorists planned to disable key bridges and highway interchanges around Washington, D.C., creating traffic bottlenecks that would prevent law enforcement reinforcements from reaching the capital area. They had also identified airports and rail stations that would be attacked to prevent federal tactical teams from being deployed from other regions. Capitol Police Chief David Thompson presented the security assessment for the Capitol building itself. Thompson had spent his career protecting the legislative branch of government, from routine security operations to major events like presidential addresses and state visits. But the Patriot Liberation Front's attack plan represented a threat beyond anything in his experience. The terrorists have conducted extensive surveillance of the Capitol complex, Thompson reported, displaying photographs that showed the terrorists had been observing security procedures and shift changes for months. They've identified weaknesses in our perimeter security, studied our response procedures, and developed tactics specifically designed to overwhelm our defensive capabilities. The Capitol assault plan was brutal in its simplicity and effectiveness. The terrorists would approach the building from multiple directions simultaneously, using explosives to breach security barriers and automatic weapons to suppress security forces. Their objective was not to occupy the building, but to cause maximum casualties among elected officials and staff during a joint session of Congress. The timing was critical to the terrorists' plan. Joint sessions of Congress brought together members of both houses of the legislature, along with senior government officials and staff members. The concentrated presence of American political leadership created an opportunity for the terrorists to achieve their objective of decapitating the federal government in a single attack. Most disturbing was evidence that the terrorists had studied the security procedures used during joint sessions and had developed specific tactics to exploit vulnerabilities in the enhanced security measures. They had identified locations where explosives could be placed to cause structural damage that would trap occupants inside the building. They had also planned to use chemical weapons to force evacuation into areas where they could achieve maximum casualties. NSA Director Patricia Walsh presented the communications intelligence that had provided federal authorities with detailed knowledge of the terrorist plot. Walsh had spent 20 years in intelligence analysis, from tracking international terrorist communications to monitoring foreign intelligence operations. But the Patriot Liberation Front case had required surveillance capabilities that pushed the boundaries of domestic intelligence collection. "We've been monitoring the terrorists' communications for the past 4 months," Walsh reported, displaying transcripts of intercepted conversations that revealed the scope of the plot. "They've been using sophisticated encryption and communication security procedures, but we've been able to penetrate their networks and gather detailed intelligence about their plans and capabilities." The communications intelligence had revealed not just the terrorist plot, but the ideological motivations that had driven 17 Americans to plan mass murder of their own government officials. The terrorists believed that the federal government had become tyrannical and that violent action was necessary to restore what they considered constitutional governance. The intercepted communications revealed a worldview that was both paranoid and grandiose. The terrorists believed they were patriots, fighting to save America from internal enemies who had corrupted the political system. They saw themselves as modern-day versions of the American revolutionaries who had fought against British rule, ignoring the fundamental difference between fighting foreign occupation and murdering democratically elected officials. Bondi studied the intelligence reports that covered the briefing room table. Each document represented hours of investigation and analysis by federal agents who had worked around the clock to uncover the terrorist plot. The scope of the investigation had required coordination between multiple agencies and had consumed resources that could have been used for dozens of other investigations. "The question before us is not whether we can prevent this attack," Bondi announced to the crisis management team. "The question is whether we can arrest these terrorists without giving them the opportunity to carry out their backup plans or inspire copycat attacks by other extremist groups." The operational challenges were significant. The terrorists were spread across 7 states and had been careful to avoid patterns that would make simultaneous arrests easy to coordinate. They had also developed contingency plans that would allow them to carry out modified attacks if their main plan was discovered. Most concerning was intelligence suggesting that other extremist groups were monitoring the situation and might launch their own attacks if the Patriot Liberation Front was arrested before carrying out their plan. FBI Director Sarah Chen presented the arrest strategy that had been developed to neutralize the terrorist threat. Chen had spent her career investigating domestic terrorism and had overseen operations against some of the most dangerous extremist groups in American history. But the Patriot Liberation Front case required operational coordination on a scale that tested the limits of federal law enforcement capabilities. "We have 17 suspects in 7 states who must be arrested simultaneously to prevent them from warning each other or activating backup plans," Chen explained, displaying a map that showed the locations where arrests would take place. "We have evidence that they've prepared dead man switches and contingency procedures that would allow them to carry out modified attacks if they believe their main plan has been compromised." The arrest operation, designated Patriot Shield, would involve over 300 federal agents coordinated across multiple time zones. Each arrest team would include FBI tactical specialists, local law enforcement officers, and explosive ordnance disposal technicians. The coordination would require precise timing to ensure that all 17 suspects were in custody before any of them could warn the others. The complexity was increased by the fact that several suspects were current or former law enforcement officers who had access to police communication systems and might be able to detect preparations for their arrest. The terrorists had also demonstrated sophisticated counter-surveillance capabilities and had been careful to avoid patterns that would make their locations predictable. But the most challenging aspect was the need to arrest the suspects without triggering the infrastructure attacks that were designed to precede the main assault on the capital. Intelligence suggested that the terrorists had prepared automated systems that would carry out the infrastructure attacks if they failed to check in at predetermined times. This meant that arrests had to be conducted in a way that would allow federal agents to access and disable the automated attack systems before they could be activated. This is not just a law enforcement operation, Bondi told the assembled crisis management team. This is a defense of American democracy against individuals who have chosen to use violence against the institutions that define our republic. We will not allow terrorists to succeed in their goal of undermining the peaceful transfer of power and the rule of law. The briefing concluded with operational assignments that would mobilize federal resources across the country. The terrorist threat that had been months in the making would be neutralized in a coordinated operation that would demonstrate that American law enforcement could protect democratic institutions from those who would destroy them through violence. As the crisis management team prepared to execute Operation Patriot Shield, Bondi remained in the Situation Room, studying the intelligence reports that had revealed the scope of the terrorist threat. Somewhere in 7 states, 17 Americans who had sworn to defend the Constitution were preparing to murder the elected officials who represented the will of the American people. But they had underestimated the determination and capabilities of the federal agents who had spent months investigating their plot. In less than 6 hours, the most sophisticated domestic terrorist attack in American history would be prevented by law enforcement officers who understood that protecting democracy sometimes required confronting those who would destroy it from within. The terrorists had declared war on American democracy. Attorney General Pam Bondi was about to demonstrate that democracy would fight back and win.